and welcome to the podcast of Loughborough University's Institute of Advanced Studies, a podcast where our international fellows discuss the most pressing issues of today that we're all facing and share their exciting research ideas. We hope you enjoyed today's talk. Thank you for tuning in. Hello and welcome to the Institute of Advanced Studies. I'm Professor Ksenia Chmutina, Director of the IS, and it's really wonderful to have you here in the room today. And also thank you for those of you joining us online. As always, we gather at the IS quite often in the last few weeks to discuss the most exciting, the most kind of important and challenging topics that really make us think about what it is we do in the world and why we do things that we do. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome today our residential fellow, Mario Panico. You've been with us for a couple of weeks now?
Yeah. 3 weeks.
Lost track of time. Time is a social construct. And it's been really wonderful to have Mario. We've had quite a few conversations, which inevitably led to discussion of food. But I believe this is not what Mario is going to be talking about.
Well, you never know, but not really.
Yeah, you never know we might end up. And if you haven't seen our Cabinet of Curiosities, Mario's latest contribution is great. It's a memory, a tin of memories, or jar of memories. So go have a look. So a couple of housekeeping rules. We are recording the presentation. It will be available on our YouTube channel and as a podcast. But we are not recording question and answer session. So feel free to ask and comment on anything. For those of you online, please post the questions in the Q&A bit on Zoom. And if there are any questions, we will share them at the end of the lecture. So Mario has a chance to hopefully answer. Well, without any further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ksenia, for this really kind introduction, and thank you all for being here and online. I'm really happy to have the chance to share with you a little part of our broader research that I just started at the University of Bologna, which is connected, as you can see, as you can read from the cover slide of my presentation, to the relationship between AI-generated images and war imagery. So the way in which AI-generated images are like constructing and educating our seeing in relation to trauma, collective trauma, and I will explain in a moment what I say when I refer to collective trauma, what I understand in relation to that. Before starting with the content, the actual content of the presentation, I thought it was a good idea to share with you why I decided to come here to Loughborough, why I landed in Loughborough. And before doing that, let me say a few words about what I do in Bologna and why I decided to apply to this fellowship that gave me the space, the welcoming space to start to think in a better way about possible research questions related to this research project. So the first point, at the University of Bologna, I work for a research center named TRAME, Center for the Semiotic Study of Memory. And basically, with other colleagues, we discussed the way in which traumatic past and traumatic events are reconstructed in different kinds of visual and material domains, in particular media ecologies, how, for example, images of traumatic past are represented in newspapers, in journalist discourses, or how, for example, museums that are connected to traumatic events are to create a narrative about the past that is taken into account. And in the last couple of years, I published two things that I wanted to share with you, in particular my book, Spaces for Nostalgia, which was basically a project related to the way in which affect theory can have a role in the way in which we represent in museum traumatic past. And in particular, in Spaces for Nostalgia, I studied the way in which people are gathering even today to commemorate the memory of the former Italian dictator Benito Mussolini in a really small town in the middle of nowhere in the north of Italy, where they do 3 times every year practices to commemorate his memory. And another publication that is coming out in a couple of days, hopefully, is an edited issue for the journal Heritage, Memory and Conflict that I edited with a colleague of mine, Ihab Salul, from the University of Amsterdam, where basically we discussed the way in which categories such as victimhood and perpetration, more than victims and perpetrators, so general categories more than single subjectivities, can be used and weaponized today when we discuss about conflict. Last but not least, because it is the main point of my presentation today, is this project that I just started, as I told you, at University of Bologna, titled AI Images and Visual Heritage, Memories, Digital Corpora and Futures, which is a project funded by the Italian Ministry of Higher Education. And the weeks that I spent here in Loughborough allowed me to like refine, perfect in a better way the research questions that I have and why I think it's important to discuss this topic today. A disclaimer: I hope I don't disappoint you when I say that I'm not an IT person, so I will not engage with AI from the computational side. I'm a memory study scholar, semiotician, so for me it's really important to understand the meaning of things, like how things assume a specific meaning for society, for groups. So I'm trying to analyze and discuss this problem of AI from a different perspective. Okay, we can discuss it. We need to know how we can generate AI images. And maybe for those of you who will join the workshop, we will also discuss, for example, how different prompts can give you like different images, but also like different meanings in relation to the images. But today I'm going to discuss more the problem related to memory, how these images, when they are out there already, can affect the way in which we remember something that happened or something that didn't happen yet. And why Loughborough? Well, the answer is pretty simple, actually. You know better than me that here in Loughborough there is a research center, media, memory, and history, where many scholars, for example, and Kintley, they work on the relationship between media, memory, and the way in which the past can be represented in this multimedia, multimodal environments. So, let's go to the main point and the project that I'm conducting. Why this project and why today? Why I think it's important to do this project today, or at least to start a common discussion about this topic. Of course, for a really simple reason. The first one is that we are like swamped with AI images. They are everywhere. You know that. I don't need you to say that. Like, you know that, like, if when you open your smartphone, when you open your social media platforms, when you open the TV, even in the TV, you will see that like there are so many images that are highly, there are so many images that are like related to this AI generation, in particular in relation to the communication of war. And then there is another problem, which is like a little bit more philosophical, if you want, which is like the problem of authenticity. What does it mean that an image can be authentic? What does it mean authenticity? Now, how those images are trying to be authentic, mocking in a way photographic styles, and I will come back on that. So this problem of authenticity, I think it's really important because like it's giving us not just a sort of like imitation of the photographic style, but also giving us a different relationship with the event that they are represented. And then the last point, which is not a real point, is more like a fil rouge, I would say. So like a common trait that is like connecting all the points and all the research I do, which is like memory. And yeah, I didn't write collective memory, cultural memory, individual memory, not because they are not different, of course they are different, but because I think it's more important to consider memory as in this case, as an intersection of the different levels. Because when we interact with AI-generated images, we have in the individual memory, for example, the way in which, for example, our tastes, our personal memories, our body, of course, the embodied experience is important, is affected by what we are looking at, but also like how collective slash cultural, how institutions or like media and media institutions in particular are like using these images affecting the collective understanding, the so-called memorial common sense of what happened. As you can imagine, those are like really, really big topic. We will need like, I think, I don't know, 10 days together to discuss in details all this problem, also like considering the philosophical tradition that is behind them. So today I decided to share with you just like more or less simple, not simple for me because like I'm still working on it, well, hopefully you will have me, one single question that is like twofold. So how are AI generated or images connected to the event they represent? And what are the implications for cultural memory and future thinking? Two things then. So let's start with the first one. The problem that because these images pretend to be authentic, they create an interesting relationship with the event that they're representing, even though there is no connection with what is represented, because of course has been generated by the machine or by the photographer, if you want. So when we look at like images of war, and in particular photographies of war, we know that like photography has traditionally been understood as a sort of like indexical medium, a material trace of what has been in front of the camera. What does it mean, indexical medium? The index is a category that has been thought by this pragmatist philosopher, Charles Sanders Peirce, who said that like we can have different kind of signs, symbols, icon, and index. One of these is the index. The index is basically a particular kind of sign where the object that produced it has a causal relationship with it. And photography can be a classical example of it. You take a picture, and then you have the physical object, and on the physical object, you have the chemical reaction that happened when the photographer took the picture, and then you have the materialization of that chemical reaction there. So you can see there is, in this sense, a sort of like causal relationship. And this is really important because, like, of course, when you think of photography, you think of the event, you say, okay, what I'm looking at is exactly what happened. Let's stay with this really general and, if you want, naive understanding of photography. I'm not going into the quite important debate about the fact that like also photography can be manipulated, that photography can also be create a sort of like different frame of what like the perspective of the photography is always like framing the image in a certain way, leaving outside something that maybe it's like important but is not represented. Let's stay with the problem of the fact that like photography and the event, they have like a cause effect relationship. And for this, photography has been understood as a sort of like visual testimony, right, of what happened in the past. And for that, they also have a sort of like evidentiary power. So sometimes when we look at picture photographies, we can say, okay, we are looking at something, we know that this happened because we are looking at it, right? So that like the photography as a material object becomes a sort of like proof of something that happened in the past. With AI images, if you want, this discussion is a little bit different. It's like changing a bit, more than a bit actually, because with the AI images, by contrast, they are not the result from an encounter with the event. Even though they circulate, or they are like circulate as they circulate as if they are traces of the event. And they produce a sort of like the so-called crisis of the referent. And here I'm putting Roland Barthes in Camera Lucida in 1980. He said like one of the most important things of photography is the CAT. Like we haven't been there. Like we know that all the time we look at pictures, we know that like the person, the object, the tree, I don't know what the picture is about. You know that like something was there in the past and now it's with us, you know? Like this relationship between past temporality and the representation and our interpretation of the image in the present, it's like really important. And if we are with AI generated images, this is quite interesting because I ask you and I ask myself, where is the event with AI generated images? Where is the relationship between what we are looking at in the AI image and the representation of the actual event itself, not the general event, the war, but like the specific event the picture is representing. But even though this is a problem that can be connected to the way in which, for example, we understand the indexical relationship with images, there is something that is allowing AI generated images, especially the ones that are like trying to imitate photography, to look as if they are photography. It is quite interesting. It is something that I have in my mind since I started this project, which is the problem of visual plausibility. So I need to read here the definition of plausibility. So plausibility means that the quality of an idea, argument, or story seeming reasonable, believable, and worthy of consideration, even without absolute proof. So an image, in order to an image, an idea in general, to be plausible, means that like we have we need to have like the problem of believability, so it must be credible, the contextual alignment and the internal alignment. So it must be coherent with the context itself. So it must be coherent with the imagery of word we have in general. It must be coherent in an internal way. So when we look at picture of AI generated images, for example, if you look at this, right? This is AI generated, even though you don't know exactly who this child is, where this picture is located, you can see that like this is a plausible image of war. Because you can recognize in this image some of the iconographic traits that are typical of AI of the war, right? The rebels, a person, a child in this case, looking like in front of the camera because he's trying to create a sort of like connection with the person who's looking at the picture and so on and so forth. So like even though these images are not like connected, as I said, to a specific event because the machine is producing it, and we'll come back on that, they can seem plausible. But then I wonder, and I ask you, what's the difference between these images and this then? All right, this is a four, and this. Also this, if you want, is an image of home, right? It's, of course, the picture, but it's like a painting by Francisco Goya, El 3 de Mayo, 1814. And if you want, if you connect what I said before about believability, the fact that it must be credible, okay, it is credible, the contextual alignment, so it aligns with the existing knowledge, and we can easily say, okay, this can be likely to be true. And the internal coherence of the image has a really strong internal coherence in singular term. It's quite evident. So what's the difference, I wonder, between this image and the AI generated ones that also like have no direct relationship with an event? The problem is that, like, as I said before, they pretend to look like photography. So the problem is that like when they circulate, so it's a problem related to the internal status of the image, if you want to use a fancy word, the semiotic status of the image, but also related to the circulation of this image. So circulation is really important, not just because that's why today we are not gonna create AI images. We're gonna do that for the workshop for those of you at the time to will have the time to come. But like today, for us, it's like more important to discuss about images that are already out there, because circulation can play also a role, right? It's not just about generation, because we can open a giant parenthesis about structure, like, for example, when you write a prompt, what kind of stereotypes, for example, are presented in the image. We can discuss the internal dynamic of the image itself. But today it's more like general, if you want, theoretical, because like, I wonder, what are we looking at? Who wants the representation of suffering and pain in these images? And and how we should account for the provenance of AI generated images? In order to answer these questions, I'm like starting to study like some literature, of course, and like there is like an ocean out there, of course, in relation to AI images and memory studies. And in particular, I like to quote a few articles. The one by Andrew Osking, AI and Memory, and the second one for the person who will come to, for the people who will come to the workshop, you will hear again the name of Natalia Laba, who is like an assistant professor from the University of Groningen, because we will use our methodology in order to like discuss the relationship between the prompt and the image, and to analyze also stereotypes with visual semiotics. But well, like the main thing that they discuss in these two articles are important, because like they point out this problem of the machine, but the machine vision. So the way in which AI generated images through some computational systems, they create the image and like allow us to discuss in a different way, as I said, this indexical relationship with the event itself. But let's take a step back before that, because this is not enough. This would be like too naive to continue the discussion without taking into account how we can create an AI generated image. As I said, not an IT person, but doesn't matter because like some knowledge, I think we all have some knowledge how to create, to write the prompt, how to create an image. Oh, I should be doing some thanks. So AI image generation works through a multi-step process in which a model transforms text into image by learning pattern from massive database. So the system is trained on million or billion of image text pairs to so it learns how visual features relate to words and concepts. So when a user enter prompt, and here we have the human agency, the text is converted into a mathematical representation of meaning. And then the model then starts from visual noise and gradually removes it step by step, guided by the prompt, in order to have an image that is statistically the closest possible to what the prompt requested. So, as you can imagine, the production is not triggered by a real event force. So there is no photographer who's taking the picture of the event itself. But like for me, the problem is interesting in general, and also when we write cute kittens playing in the baskets, right? But for me, another reflection is needed, I think, when we discuss images related to work. So when the prompt is a little bit different, and when the images we produce are a little bit different, that are connected, for example, to conflicts, when like the representation and the role of like who is the victim for whom, who is the perpetrator for whom, and how this like let's say actorial rules in the memory dynamics are like compromised and also stratified. Not spoiler. So basically, this is the situation. Of course, this is like a sort of like a mirror kind of like a chart, even though it's more complicated than that. But like for the discussion that we're having today, I think it's like quite interesting to say that like in the photographic regime, we have the event of the world, the photographer, and then the photograph. So that's sort of like the photograph is a sort of like bridge, sort of mediator between what happened and what we can see, even though we are not there. So the photograph creates not just like an image of the past, but also sort of like temporal connection between past and present. And then in the AI generated generative regime, the situation is a little bit different. Again, a little bit meaning that like it's really different because like when we write the prompt, as I said, the machine is working in this latent space where it represents billion and billion of images that the machine itself is using to train itself in order to produce an image that is somehow familiar. Familiar because it's like an image that comes from is the derivation of all these images that are already there, and usually all the images that are already there are like more or less, biased by the system that has created. So more than having like a sort of like connection, indexical connection between the event and the material object itself, in this case, I have the impression that AI generated images looks like the trace not of the event but of the archive itself, of the knowledge that we already have, of the so-called already seen, right? So the interesting thing for me about AI generated image and memory is that like what does it mean that like this image is quoting something that we already seen, something that was already in the machine to create something that is completely new, because every single conflict is of course different. We can have some similarities in terms of representation, but like we will see that there are also like some political in terms of politics representation problems. So the difference in the memory issue is like it's not like this happened but this is how things look like when they happen. And as you can see, the difference is quite important because like we can have a photograph that is like framing something that really like happening in reality, even though we can say, we can, as I said before, we can start a really long conversation about the framing, what's outside the image, and so on and so forth. We can open this conversation, we can do that. So, but like, it's interesting to see that like maybe from a semiotic perspective, more than an index, now we're talking about iconicity. Again, actually, nothing new, but like we're talking about things that like look similar to something else, more the things that are like related to the event itself. What does it mean that the things look like something else? That like AI generated images, here there is another article by Natalia Laba. They draw on photojournalistic styles, they employ familiar palettes, composition and posture that we already know in order to create this sort of like, as I said, the already seen. And if you look at like different AI generated images that I found online, I didn't generate these images. You always have like this sort of like Hollywood style, end of the world imagery, soldier seen from behind, smokes and rubble, dramatic backlighting, opposite sides of the conflict facing each other. You know, you have always like this kind of representation. For me, is not a deterministic problem. So I'm not saying that like, okay, we should have different kind of AI generated images. We should have more realistic and less similar to the past. Because like if you change the prompt, you change the image. So this is not like an essentialist problem about the AI generated images. For me, as I said, as always, is a memory thing, is a memory issue, right? But another because like when I start a new project, what I like the most is like to like think of possible objection to my own argument, right? Because I think it's like people like somehow preemptive memory, if you want. But like so I was wondering because like I used to I did my PhD in like semiotics and visual studies, no? So I was wondering, okay, but like this already seen has always been there. So like if you think these two images, the style, the iconography that is created, meaning it's called anachronism of the images. So like some images are like repeating some styles or from images from the past, not in a voluntary way, like not because they want to do so, because it happens, right? But the problem is that like the image is quoting something else, but the image that has been quoted is also like somehow changing its own meaning. So it has been always been that. Like if you look at like the history of the images, this problem of like quotation and the already seen, it's pretty common. It's not something something new. Umberto Eco, and I'm happy to mention him because tomorrow is like the 10th anniversary of his death. And as a Bolognese scholar, I like to remember Umberto Eco. Umberto Eco used to say that all the books that we wrote as a scholar are always the quotation of all books that we read, of like, you know, the combination of all the books that we read. So the book that we write is something that we already read. So this is quite true. It's quite like, even when we talk, like if you talk like there's the linguistic theory about the speech act, right? When we talk, we are using the language, like we're using the language, which is like the general rule that we know are like related. And we are using like sort of different parts of this like general rule that we know. And we are creating the combination, but the sentence that we are pronouncing is something that we already read in a way, heard, sorry, in a way. So what's new then? I was wondering. Well, for me, if there is something new, if there is something that needed to be discussed, is the political role that this kind of images can have. So it's like basically from a memory studies perspective, I think the problem is not the visual similarity per se, because you can say, okay, these images are similar, okay, this reminds me to this and that. But the fact that faces becomes interchangeable, situation collapse into recognizable types and stereotypes. Difference is not erased, but statistically smoothened. So, for example, in terms of politics of representation, always thinking of the fact that I have in mind images of conflict, story lose specificity and are biased by the prompt. Who's writing the prompt? And who's like giving images to the machine, not in a conspiracy theory kind of situation, like don't use internet, so on and so forth. Like, but it's a real question. It's a problem of agency, right? Who has the agency and the ownership to create, to write the prompt, but also like to feed the machine itself. So what once functioned as testimony, the photograph, the image of the conflict, becomes more like a visual category. So what once carried the weight of a particular history becomes an instance of a style. So the problem is not that we no longer know what has happened, because we know what has happened. Like we are not like the naive to think that like we look at an AI picture and we understand the world. Of course, the AI picture is just like a single drop in an ocean of multimedia environment in which we live. But the problem is that like we gradually lose the ability to remember who it happened to. And this is a problem, again, bringing AI to the things that I do. This is a problem of like creation of categories in memory dynamics. So any victim can be anyone. Any perpetrator resembles every other. Any places can be everywhere, and the time frame can be anything. And this problem of the time frame, so as after this discussion about what's changing and why the already seen for me in the AI generated image is problematic, I want to have time. I want to go to this idea of how we can create, how AI images create different time frame and how they trouble a bit this logic of temporality, right? Because if we look at images of the past, and the image of the past, there is no connection to the event, so we lose indexicality. We have the crisis of the referent, as we said. So the person that you look at the AI image is not a real person. This is about the past or the near past, the present, right? The ongoing conflict. What about the future, though? And we're looking at Emily because, of course, as I said before, I said come to opera because there is this slide, the media center, but also because Emily wrote a lot about collective imagination in relation to temporality, past, present, and future. And this is something that I am also like trying to understand with this research. So not just about the past, because if you want the problem of like the fake indexicality, the pseudo indexicality is, if possible, maybe you can say the opposite. We can discuss about it during the Q&A. For me, it's quite clear how it works and how it shifted from classical images. But I think that like the problem of plausibility, as I said before, and the problem of possibility of these images, it's even more interesting when we look at the future. So, for example, as a really simple example. Yesterday, I was preparing the presentation, trying the slide, and so on and so forth, and I was thinking about possible scenarios of this presentation, right? And I thought, okay, there will be a question, okay, there will be a slide, there will be me saying this, and this. And I didn't think about the fact that maybe a giant octopus is entering the room and asking me a question. It's possible though, because imagine overnight they invented a system that an octopus can enter in the room and ask a question, but it is not plausible. Because what we know, our culture, our knowledge, our society, our habits, are saying to us, it's unlikely that a giant octopus, she's checking if the octopus It's why it was really perfect timing. You never know. Exactly, it's possible, right? It's like there is a small chance that these things is happening. But we know because we're like human beings immersed in like a social environment, we have some knowledge about the so-called habits, right? We know how to behave. We know what's going to happen most likely. We know that an octopus is not entering. So the distinction between plausibility and possibility in future thinking is quite interesting, I think, right? Also because we can never have the 100% certainty that everything, because again, the octopus is the choice, right? But let's go back to these two categories in relation to AI images, considering what we said until now, right? So the same mechanism that turns the past into statistical repetition also turns the future into a derivation from the archive. And this is quite important, I think, because the topic becomes, I think, even more political, because it's a problem of visual literacy. It's a problem of how these images are like creating a sort of like common sense of possible and plausible future, but not just as I said before, not images that we can create, because you can open Mind Journey, which is a system for AI generated the images, and you can write, can you create an image of future of a peaceful future in the Gaza Strip, and you can create an image. The problem is not the generation of the image per se, for me, as I said, but it's the way in which, like, specific images, because there are some people that have more agency than us, more power than us, not more agency, more power than us, can, in a way, create this, like, common vocabulary, and we start to think that, like, possible and plausible can collapse. And I give you some examples. So the story of this video, you saw this video, can we show it, and then we can. So I have 5 minutes to breathe. Also with the sound, maybe I change with mine. Thank you.
Sure.
Tunnels coming to set you free, bringing the light for all to see. No more tunnels, no more fear. Trump Gaza is finally here. Trump Gaza shining bright, golden future, a brand new light. Feast and dance, the deal is done. Trump Gaza #1. Trump Gaza shining bright, golden future, a brand new light. Feast and dance, the deal is done. Trump Gaza #1.
We have an opportunity to do something that could be phenomenal. And
well, looking forward to that. So there are many layers, as you can imagine. This video is really problematic. If I can use my French, disgusting. Like, but let's have like, as every single media object, they have lives. Like they live outside the production itself. This video has been shared by Donald Trump last February, so 1 year that he shared this video, but he didn't generate this video. This video was produced by an IT person to create a social to mocking what Trump used to say about the Gaza Riviera and the fact that Gaza could be a really important touristic spot. But Trump saw the video, and thought that, like, okay, this is in line with what I think, so I'm going to share it. This is really, really interesting in terms of like the way in which the image circulate and how the intention of the images are different from the intention of the person who are sharing the image. Because everyone, when looked at this picture, thought this is what Trump created. This is what Trump wants. It is what Trump wants, of course. But in terms of like the way in which the image circulate and the literacy, like we started to think creating the future with the images again is not something new. That's like the fun part of studying AI images, because we think that we are doing something different, something new. We are doing history of the images, like we did in the Middle Age, like we did with the contemporary arts, like we did with political arts. The main aspect again is like the creation and what kind of trace from the archive these images are taking with them. So you saw like what this images is producing. As I said during the workshop, we will discuss like who is represented, how people are represented, who like also like what kind of like colonial and Western imagery the video is producing. But today is important that like Trump with this video created a precedent. Like we have a year zero, let's say, of this like futurity of the Gaza Strip. Another really disturbing example is the one. My brain is like trying not like I'm trying with all my energies to remember the name of this person, but there is something in my brain that's refusing that. Maybe I'm gonna Gila Gamliel is like an Israeli politician. Certain point shared this video after Trump. Trump shared this video in February 2025. She shared this video in July 2025, something like that. Again, the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip. Alarms coming back. This is not by chance. As I said before, the recreation of an injury that is like already, presented. Because if you Google if you Google City of the Future, this is the only thing that I did with my computer for this presentation in terms of AI generated, in terms of like create research of content. So I Google images, City of the Future. That's all the images you have. Those are all the images that are like that the data set is using to feed itself. And to create then, when you ask create me the city of the future and so on and so forth. What's the problem here? Beside the more theoretical aspect related to plausibility and possibility. It's another thing that images, more than words, because the future has been like we always think about the future. We were thinking about what we're gonna have for dinner this weekend. We always think about the future. We love the future. Also, like many of the terrible emotion that we feel all the time, anxiety. Anxiety is worrying about the future, worrying about the possible and the plausible possibility. So like future is really important for the way in which we behave, for the way in which we think. But with the images, it's a little bit different because images is creating in our mind, this is something also connected to cognition, a sort of like precedent idea, something that we can start from. For example, when you read the book, you have an image of the characters in your mind. Then you look at the movie, and you have a different image, and sometimes clash, sometimes like coherent, and so forth. Is that really? But then in the collective imaginary, all the time that you will see about the specific character, you will see the image that is like comes from the movie because it's more recognizable, it's normalized. So for me, with these images, it's quite interesting to see one aspect more than others. The political problem of how deconstruction and reconstruction is normalized in this video without taking into account all the political and traumatic aspects that are connected to what happened to the genocide in Gaza. And in particular, it is quite interesting for me to discuss 3 points. And with this, I'm going to conclude. I have just one this thing to say, and then a small footnote, let's say, and then I finish. So this logic so we have on the one hand plausibility, possibility. On the other hand, we have the dynamic of reconstruction and destruction and reconstruction in in this techno hyper utopian future of cities that we can have. So this logic entails a depolitization of the future, raising the question of who has the authority to define and own futurity. When the future is derived from existing archives and probabilistic models, it becomes increasingly insulated from contestation and political imagination. It contributes to normalization of destruction insofar as violent or catastrophic scenarios are rendered familiar to repetition and combination, and thus appear as expected outcomes rather than conditioned to be challenged. Destroying, then you can reconstruct. It forecloses the possibility of visualizing reconstruction in terms of justice and sustainable transformation. Reconstruction is no longer imagined as a site for political struggle and ethical reconfiguration. Of course, reconstruction is important. Again, this is not something that we learn with the conflict in Sudan, Ukraine, and Palestine. This is something that we learn, with like all the wars that we had in the past. Like reconstruction is important. Also, not the non-reconstruction is important. Look at Coventry, but like in terms of like the memory of the construction is more, the preservation of the destruction is also important, but this is another topic. So reconstruction is no longer imagined as a site of political struggle or ethical reconfiguration, but it's a technical, a managerial continuation of the present. So, and with this I conclude really, in a war and post-war society future, ceases to function as a space of symbolic struggle with these images, with the way in which these images circulate, and instead becomes a space of hegemonic confirmation. And as I said before, if we have the main problem, who owns not the future, who owns the imagination of the future? And when I say imagination, of course, I'm thinking of future collective thinking, but also imagination in terms of visual literacy. The way in which like these images are like creating in our collective mind, and I say collective mind in terms of collective memory, so not like the combination of different individual memories, but now, for example, institutions are creating common sense schools, right? We remember history, something happened from 1959 to 1945, we learn at school that something happened, right? It is true, but also like create a common memory in this sense, because the institution is also like helping us to remember, not just because we remember as a single individuals. With this, I conclude. I just wanted to mention something, as I said, a footnote, because imagining this paper as an article, this would be like a final thought. Something is happening again. As I said before, AI images are trying to imitate photography, but now it's interesting how like there are some images that like we are not sure that are created by AI images, but they are trying to imitate AI images. And creating this like vicious circle. And I'm going to show you this example. This is a slide that has been shared during the Board of Peace, the international organization led by Trump. And they shared, his son-in-law at a certain point shared this slide, also New Gaza, but New Rafa is quite interesting. But there is a debate online, journalists and IT specialists are saying, we are not sure that this image is AI generated. Most likely is CGI, so created with the computer, which doesn't mean that can be generated by AI, but most likely there is a human being that is like, a person that is like, doing this with the computer. So there is an agency, if you want, there is also creativity. But it's interesting how, even though we don't know, this can open a debate about the vicious circle, as I said before, these images are like, they look like AI generated images. So it's interesting to see that like, it's a circle. Before was like before. Also because with the AI images, everything is like changing in a second. Maybe this presentation will be old in half an hour, considering how fast is the AI at the moment. But, yeah, this is the debate that I mentioned. Donald Trump with risk vision gas is like AI generated expert says. And for me, as I said before, I don't believe in the essentialistic definition of it. For me, it's not really important to say like this is AI, this is not AI. For me, it's like the effect that these images produce, more than like to determine are they AI, they are not AI. Can be an important question, of course, that we can discuss, because maybe different effects this thing can create before the circulation of the image. But for me, it's more important is like they look the same and they are problematic in terms of the way in which we imagine the future and in the way in which we imagine reconstruction in times of conflict. Yeah, this is the other image of Gaza, which is exactly what Trump thought, even though we don't know. And this is actually what Rafah is today, with people, which I think is like an important detail that is missing in all the images that we saw before. Thank you very much. Grazie. Grazie mille.
Thank you for listening to the podcast of Loughborough University's Institute of Advanced Studies. A quick reminder about how to stay connected.
You can find us on Blue Sky, LinkedIn, and Instagram, and you can also watch the presentations on YouTube. The podcast is available on all the major platforms. Please download, share, and most importantly, subscribe. See you next time.